Okay, Prof. Greg, um, thank you so much for your willingness to come here to talk at our little philosophy hub.
Good. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you all.
Okay, maybe before we start our talk, I'll try to introduce our hub first, and then I'll introduce you as the speaker, and maybe I'll try to translate our talks into Indonesians. So maybe it's okay. Just talk. Just finish when you want to finish, and I'll try to translate it as short as possible, Prof. Daus.
Right. Yes, I'm sorry. I have no Indonesian to converse in, but there we are.
Yeah, it's okay. Okay. Yeah. So good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, Prof. Daus from New Zealand. So today we're really grateful for you guys, and of course for Greg, Prof. Daus' willingness to come and talk at our hub. So before we talk about the discussions about the book, Deprovincializing Science and Religion, I want to introduce what is Skole and who's Prof. Daus first. Okay, so Skole is a philosophy hub who provide an accessible philosophy talks for everyone's and also for laymen, for a public audience. We organize weekly philosophy talks, write daily articles, and weekly discussions for free in hope to increase public criticism. We invite global and local philosophers for our weekly discussions. Some of them are William Lane Craig, Prof. Graham Maltby, Caleb Gaff, Hadito Sandi from Indonesia, Yuji Nagasawa, and some others philosophers. We could say that we are the first philosophy hub in Indonesia who have the initiative to invite global philosophers to talk here for Indonesian audience, because we acknowledge the importance to have a broader and a global connection with philosophers around the globe to make us, whether you're in academia or not, to be aware of the progress, issues, topics which currently discussed by the global community of philosophers. And also, we're today here, Prof. Greg Daus with us today. Thank you again, Prof. Daus. So Prof. Greg holds a part-time position as a professor in religious studies in University of Otago, while also teaching within the philosophy department. He teaches on religion, science, and magic, and contributes to another course on the philosophy of religion. His most recent book is Deprovincializing Science and Religion, which published by Cambridge in 2021 February. One of the chapters, one of the elements in philosophy of religion, and also in 2009, Theism and Explanation, which both of them discuss, and especially the Deprovincializing Science and Religion, discuss the relation between scientific and religious modes of explanations. And some of his recent papers are Spirit Postations as a source of knowledge in 2019 and Identifying Pseudoscience, a Social Process in Criterion in 2018. So yeah, today we're going to talk about his recent book, Deprovincializing Science and Religion. And once again, thank you, Prof. Greg. You think you need to add something of your bio?
No, that all sounds very good. Perhaps some other things will come up in the course of discussion, but that's fine.
Okay, sure. So yeah, let's go to the talk. Yeah, Prof. Daus. So before we talk and discuss about your book, we usually ask these questions to every philosophers that come here. We always want to know first what philosophy is for you, and how could you first introduce to philosophy. Also, at the end, to indulge in academic philosophy.
Right. Well, I think there are two ways of thinking about philosophy that appeal to me. One is encapsulated in a phrase of Jerry Fodor. Jerry Fodor remarked in an article some years ago that the task of philosophers was to mind other people's business. So one task of philosophy is to examine the assumptions, the presuppositions, which people are taking for granted in some field of inquiry. So this tends to be the more applied forms of philosophy, like philosophy of science or philosophy of art or philosophy of religion, where we look at the assumptions which underlie these activities and we subject those assumptions to critical examination. So that's often the philosophy of some subject or another, minding other people's business. But I guess the other kind of philosophy is what Wilfrid Sellars famously described as understanding how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So trying to get a very broad synoptic view of human thinking, of human activity, of the ways in which human beings interact with and understand the world. And I guess that's what I've been trying to do recently, is to understand in a very, very broad way how human beings interact with and understand the world. And science and religion are, of course, two ways in which they do so.
Yeah. Okay, I'll translate it, Prof. Daus. Jadi singkatnya, menurut Prof. Daus, filsafat itu bisa dipahami sebagai dua cara ya. Pertama, jadi fodor, itu filsafat adalah berurusan dengan urusan orang lain. Ya, sama seperti filsafat sains, filsafat seni, dan sebagainya. Jadi berurusan dengan urusan orang lain, minding other people businesses. Kedua, itu Sellars. Secara singkat memahami bagaimana dunia berada untuk memiliki gambaran luas mengenai pemikiran manusia, aktivitas yang mana manusia berinteraksi dan memahami dunia. Ya, jadi poinnya adalah untuk memahami bagaimana manusia berinteraksi dengan dunia. And so, how could you first introduce the philosophy, Prof. Daus?
Well, I didn't start off doing philosophy. I began by doing theology because I began studying within the Roman Catholic Church tradition and studying for the priesthood originally and studying theology in that context. So it was really from being immersed in the world of religion that I developed an interest in philosophical questions. Because, of course, there are forms of theology which are quite philosophical. I mean, in the Roman Catholic tradition, which I was brought up in, people like Thomas Aquinas are very major figures. And they, of course, were as much philosophers as they were theologians. And one can read their work as the work of philosophers. So I think that was really my first introduction to philosophy. I remember when I was studying theology, reading, for example, Alfred North Whitehead's book, Process and Reality, a very large and extraordinarily difficult book. I can't say I read it all because it was just too difficult. But no, that was the sort of philosophy I was interested in because Whitehead had a rather unusual conception of God and God's relationship to the world within what became known as process theology. So I guess my first introduction to philosophy occurred in that context of studying theology. Also, in the Roman Catholic Church, sorry, I'm giving you a lot to translate, but in the Roman Catholic Church, if you were studying to be a priest, you did 2 years of philosophy, followed by 3 years of theology. So a training in philosophy was built into your theological study.
Yeah, thank you. Jadi Prof. Daus itu pertama kali kenal filsafat dari teologi karena beliau itu dulu adalah seorang friar imam ya, seorang imam di gereja Katolik Roma. Jadi pertama kali bertemu dengan orang-orang seperti Thomas Aquinas, terus tadi ya Alfred North Whitehead, filsafat prosesnya gitu. Jadi memang pertama-tama dari teologi baru ke filsafat. And I think, Prof. Daus, a lot of people actually experience what you experience. I mean, I prefer to philosophy because of my religious upbringing. So, I learned philosophy because of my religious upbringings, and then right now I'm doing philosophy also for my graduate studies.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's common because both in the Christian and in the Muslim world and in the Jewish world as well, but particularly in the Christian and the Muslim world, you have had always a certain interaction between philosophy and theology, between falsafa and kalam, if you like, but sometimes an uneasy interaction, sometimes something of a tension, but nonetheless, say, an interaction going back many centuries.
Ya, jadi memang biasa teman-teman untuk antara filsafat dan teologi itu bertemu. Entah itu interaksinya agak tegang, kadang falsafah, kalam gitu kalau di Islam ya, lalu dan semacamnya. Jadi memang itu biasa dan saya rasa teman-teman juga begitu ya. Mungkin berangkatnya dari agama pertama-tama. And so at the end, how do you indulge in academic philosophy and also have an interest in the philosophy of religion?
I think what I've been keen to do is to broaden the scope of the philosophy of religion. I mean, there are quite a number of people doing this at the moment. My former student, Tesis, who I think taught you for a time, he is certainly very keen on doing this. He's been writing work, as you know, on animism, for example, as a form of religion. But also Eugen Nagasawa, whom you have talked to, I think, and who edited this series. He's involved in a big project based in the United Kingdom to broaden the scope of the philosophy of religion. And there are quite a number of people throughout the world working at this who feel that the philosophy of religion has been too narrowly focused on Christianity and a particular type of Christian theism, rather than looking at religion more broadly. So that's been my concern. To be honest, I was getting a bit bored with a lot of the traditional arguments for and against the existence of God and so on, and wanted to broaden the scope of the discussion.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And actually, we got the chance, the opportunity to have the grants to translate all this work to Indonesians from the Global Philosophy Project. Yeah, so I agree with you. Yeah, it's sometimes we talk too much about, and also in Indonesia too, of course, an apologetics mode, if I could say, arguments for the existence of God and etc. Okay, I'll translate it first, Prof. Dos. Jadi Prof. Dos ini punya concern untuk memperluas konteks filsafat agama. Karena kebelakangan ini filsafat agama umumnya tuh sangat sempit, teman-teman. Umumnya ngomongin teisme Kristen, ya kan? Jadi padahal filsafat agama jauh lebih kaya daripada itu. Dan beberapa murid-murid dan misalnya T.D. Smith yang pernah sekolah undang juga itu sempat ngomongin animisme kan. Nah itu juga hal yang menarik sebenarnya di konteks filsafat agama karena masih jarang. Atau misalnya orang lain, Eugen Nagasawa juga sempat atau sedang dalam proyek untuk melakukan perluasan pemahaman akan yang namanya filsafat agama. Jadi nggak melulu soal Kristen. Meskipun itu penting, meskipun itu baik, tapi kita perlu buka yang lain, Islam, Buddhis, Hindu, dan yang lainnya. Mungkin ini juga bisa jadi semangat teman-teman untuk mengerjakan hal tersebut. Siapa tahu teman-teman punya concern untuk lebih memperluas. Okay, thank you, Prof. Dos, for your introductions. Maybe I'll go to the book, Prof. Dos. I wonder first, could you explain to us what do you mean by deprovincializing in the title of your book?
Well, I mean very much doing the same thing as many people are trying to do for the philosophy of religion, which is that of broadening the scope of the discussion. That the normal science and religion discussions, and there are some very good ones out there, but they've often focused on just a small subset of the ways in which human beings interact with and understand the world. So they're focused on modern science, that which developed in Europe in the 17th century, and generally the Christian religion and its interaction with modern science, say from the time of Galileo onwards, all of which is very interesting. I mean, I've written myself a book on the Galileo affair, which is extraordinarily interesting. But it seems to me that there are other forms of science in human history. And of course, there are many other forms of religion other than Christianity. And they too have interacted sometimes in very different ways. So that was what this book was trying to do, was to give once again, a broader context for our religion and science discussions.
Ya, jadi kalau teman-teman sadar, judul bukunya Deprovincializing Science and Religion. Saya nanya, Deprovincializing itu artinya apa sih? Itu tadi ya, memperluas perbincangan yang namanya sains dan agama. Kenapa? Karena umumnya sains diskusi hubungan di antara keduanya. Sure, no worries. Jadi hubungan di antara keduanya itu umumnya yaitu pakai kacamata Kristen, ya, atau kedua pakai kacamata sains modern abad ke-19 di Eropa. Padahal ada banyak cara mengada daripada sains dan agama itu sendiri. Agama tentu kita tahu bukan cuma agama institusional aja, agama Kristen, Islam, Buddha, dan semacamnya, tapi juga lebih broad daripada itu, dan nanti kita akan bahas. Demikian juga sains. Ada cara-cara lainnya untuk memahami sains itu sendiri. Prof. Dos, do you want to add something, or I'll go to the next questions? Do you want to add something, or just continue to my next questions? You're still unmuted. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Prof. Okay, sorry, Prof. Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Sorry, I just unmuted the microphone briefly because I was coughing. Right. Sorry. Now your question again.
Do you want to add something, or I'll go to the next questions?
You can go to the next question. I think that will be fine. Yep.
Okay. Before we're going deeper to talk about the relation between science and religion, maybe I want to ask first, what do you mean by science? Or you use the term scientia in your book, and religion.
Yes, what I was trying to do was to come up with a broader conception of science. Most of us think of science as the set of practices which developed in Europe, in Western Europe, in the 17th century, which involve, I think, two things. They involve the experimental method, and they also involve often some kind of mathematical modeling. Galilei was probably the founder in many respects of this kind of science. And Galileo both conducted experiments, rolling balls down inclined planes, for example, to test the speed of free fall. But Galileo also famously remarked that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, so both experimentation and mathematical modeling. Now, this kind of science has been enormously successful, of course. It's given us all kinds of gifts, really, that we wouldn't have had before. So we can now fight the coronavirus by developing vaccines, for example, which enable us to counter the effects of the virus, all of which is a result of what modern science has given us. But the thing is that there have been other ways of thinking about the natural world and trying to understand its principles. For example, the natural philosophy pioneered by Aristotle. Or in China, you had a kind of correlative cosmology, I call it, which understood the natural world in terms of principles such as qi or yin and yang, and so on. Quite different principles from those of modern science, but also a systematic way of understanding the natural world and how it operates. And I think these should be regarded as science as well. So there have been forms of science other than modern science, as well as forms of religion other than Christianity.
I translate it. Jadi, teman-teman, sains itu menurut Prof. Daus, seperti yang tadi, umumnya kita mengasosiasikan sains dengan sains yang ada di abad ke-17, yang kental dengan nuansa eksperimen, model matematis, dan sebagainya. Misalnya yang dilakukan sama Galileo, dan juga bisa kita bilang sebagai penemunya. ia bereksperimen dengan berbagai cara. Juga ia mengatakan bahwa dunia dapat dibahasakan secara matematis. Dan tentu sangat sukses, nggak bisa dipungkiri. Bisa melawan COVID, ATC. Tetapi pada nyatanya ada cara lain loh untuk memahami dunia alamiah. Misal, filsafat alam dari Aristoteles di Yunani ya, di filsafat Yunani, dan juga misalnya di China, yaitu kosmologi korelatif, yin and yang, feng shui, dan berbagai bentuk lain yang berbeda dari sains modern, tetapi merupakan cara yang sistematis juga. Jadi poinnya adalah ada berbagai cara, berbagai bentuk untuk memahami alam selain secara sains modern. Prof. Das, what actually are the other forms of religion other than Christianity? Could you elaborate it more?
Right, good. Well, of course, you have what we often think of as the big 5 world religions. And obviously you have Judaism and Islam, which belong, broadly speaking, to the same family of religions as Christianity. But you also have a religion such as Buddhism, which insofar as it doesn't depend on the idea of a deity, a supreme deity, but is more presents itself as a path to enlightenment, a way to escape the cycle of rebirth, has a very different kind of, well, if you were to relate science and Buddhism, you'd get a different kind of picture from relating science and Christianity, how the two relate. But you also then get religions like the Advaita tradition of Hinduism, which don't make a clear distinction between God and the soul, but see Atman and Brahman as ultimately one. So a rather different conception of deity, which is non-dualistic. So even within those big 5 religions, you've got big differences in how God is thought of, if God is features at all in the tradition, but also, of course, how knowledge of God and knowledge of the natural world, knowledge about salvation, about liberation, and knowledge of the natural world would relate to one another. But of course, in addition to that, you also have what I've called in the book diffused religions, societies in which religious practices are not gathered together and institutionalized into something like a church, an institutional community with leaders and bodies of doctrine. But the religious practices are scattered throughout the society, and many small-scale societies are like this. They have religious practices, but they don't have what you might think of as an institutionalized religion. And of course, what Teddy, my former student, your former teacher, I think he's coming back soon, what he was writing about recently was, and is editing a volume on at the moment, is animism, the idea that features of the natural world, at least some of them, have an inner life like our own, so we can relate to them the way you would relate to persons. A very, very common, very ancient, very, very widespread form of religious practice, but one of which philosophers have largely ignored. So I think, again, you've got this big range of practices which count as religious.
Ya, jadi terkait hubungan antara sains dan agama, tadi kan udah ngomongin nih, sains ada banyak caranya, dan demikian juga agama. Gitu ya. Karena umumnya, sekali lagi, kalau ngomongin agama dan sains, hubungan antara keduanya, kita pakai kacamata Islam dan Kristen yang nuansanya sama-sama Abrahamik. Tetapi pada nyatanya ada bentuk-bentuk lainnya, ya, kayak Hinduisme dan juga Buddhisme. Dalam Buddhisme misalnya, kita tidak mengenal soal yang dewa-dewi, gitu ya, tidak ada Tuhan. Gitu ya. Dan kalau misalnya sains dan Buddhisme berurusan atau berdialog, itu akan berbeda juga caranya. Dan juga di agama Hinduisme yang tidak membedakan antara diri dan dunia, ya. Atman dan Brahman basically satu hal. Jadi non-dualistik. Jadi di dalam 5 agama besar aja, itu udah berbeda semua tuh. Pengetahuan soal Tuhan, keselamatan, dan alam, bagi mereka yang non-Kristen, itu berhubungan semua. Dan kedua, selain agama-agama besar, ada juga diffuse religion, atau sebagian orang bilangnya world religions. Jadi berbeda gitu loh. Yang mana kita kenal sebagai animisme, praktik agama yang tersebar di seluruh dunia, yang berbeda dari agama institusional yang kita kenal sekarang ini. Sangat tua, tersebar, tapi terbaikan sama yang punya filsafat. Nah, jadi mereka punya cara-cara sendiri untuk memahami yang ilahiyah, dan pada saat bersamaan cara-cara yang berbeda juga dalam memahami yang natural atau yang alamiah. Nah, ini akan menjadi semakin menarik nih, teman-teman. Okay, Prof. I'm going to continue to the next questions ya. So you use 4 dimensions when you're talking about the relation between science or scientia in the broader sense and religion also in the broader sense. Could you share about those 4 dimensions regarding how science and religion could relate?
Yes. I think a very important idea here is that science and religion are social practices. Now, philosophers are very interested in beliefs because beliefs take propositional form and can be analyzed for their coherence, for the degree to which they enjoy evidential support. But beliefs are only one dimension of religion. And in fact, in many religions, beliefs don't have a very prominent role. I'm going to just put into the chat, if that's all right. I'll just put in a chat note for everyone. The historian Alan Strathern makes a distinction between immanentist and, that's meant to read, transcendentalist religions. Transcendentalist religions make a sharp distinction between God and the world. Immanentist religions seem divinity as animists do, as somehow inherent in the world. And one of the characteristics of immanentist religions, like those of small-scale societies, is that belief is not a big issue. There aren't bodies of doctrine. There are no scholars charged with preserving a body of belief. So to focus on beliefs is not only to focus on just one aspect of religion, it's to focus on something that in some religious practices has a relatively minor role to play. So what I've called the cognitive dimension of religion, the first dimension I've called cognitive, is just one of many, because religion's a social practice and has other dimensions as well. Perhaps I'll stop there and we'll come back to the other dimensions in a moment to give you a chance to translate.
Oke, jadi pertanyaanku begini, teman-teman. Kira-kira aspek apa saja yang perlu diperbincangkan, yang perlu di-compare ya, ketika kita bicara soal sains dan agama, gitu kan? Nah, ada 4 dimensi yang bisa diperbincangkan, dan salah satunya yang pertama itu adalah yang kognitif, gitu ya. Apa tuh maksudnya? Jadi ketika ngomongin soal agama dan sains, kita harus lihat dulu nih relasi dengan belief atau kepercayaan. Nah, kepercayaan itu kan sesuatu hal yang bisa dijadikan di dalam bentuk yang proposisional. Tetapi itu hanya salah satu aspek saja di dalam konteks keberagaman atau di dalam beragama. Di dalam beberapa agama lainnya, itu nggak sedemikian pentingnya. Ada 2 jenis agama ya, agama imanen sama agama yang transcendental. Agama-agama transcendental, agama kita ya, samawi segala macam, itu agama yang menekankan pentingnya aspek belief. Tapi agama imanen, ya, agama-agama yang dianut sama orang-orang dari kelompok-kelompok yang kecil, gitu ya, itu sebenarnya belief atau kepercayaan nggak punya peran yang terlalu penting. Dan itu nggak masalah untuk nggak dimiliki. Nggak ada yang namanya tubuh doktrin, tidak ada akademisi, dan sebagainya. Jadi di dalam agama mereka, belief atau kepercayaan punya peran yang sangat minor. Nah, ini namanya dimensi kognitif, dan hanya salah satu dimensinya saja. Please continue.
Right. And I think one scholar I'm very dependent upon here is Mikael Stenmark. Mikael Stenmark's a Swedish theologian, actually, who wrote a book called How to Relate Science and Religion. Very useful work. And he also talks about 4 dimensions, from which really I've taken the clue for what I'm doing. So the second dimension will be teleological dimension. Because religion and science are social practices, activities in which groups of people engage, they each have a goal. So one question you can ask is, what are the goals of science and religion? So, for example, Stenmark says that the goal of religion is to make the world existentially intelligible, whereas the goal of science, at least modern science, is to make the world predictively intelligible. To make the world predictively intelligible, to understand the world in a way which will enable us successfully to predict its activities. So immediately you can see that if you take a picture like this, religions have goals, namely shedding light on human existence, that at least modern science doesn't. Some other forms of science did. Some other forms of science, like the correlative cosmology of ancient China, did in fact try to make human existence intelligible as well. But modern science has tended to leave that question aside and is focused on making the natural world predictably intelligible, if you like, predictively. We can accurately predict its operations. So that will be a second dimension of both science and religion.
Iya, jadi dimensi kedua, dimensi teleologis ya. Kita membandingkannya lewat daripada tujuan dari sains dan agama. Jadi agama adalah, dan sains itu kan praktik sosial, jadi masing-masing punya tujuannya nih. Apa sih tujuan sains dan agama? Kalau ngutip daripada Michael Steinberg tadi, agama itu membuat dunia secara eksistensial punya makna inteligensianya bagi manusia. Sedangkan sains membuat dunia dapat diterjemahkan atau diprediksi secara inteligensia. Nah, modern science atau sains modern umumnya udah abai sama peran daripada pendekatan untuk membuat dunia bisa dipahami secara inteligensia, punya makna gitu ya. Nah, tapi beberapa bentuk agama lainnya, sains lainnya, sainsia, misalnya kosmologi korelatifnya di China itu berusaha membuat kehidupan manusia untuk dapat dipahami juga secara inteligensia. Nah, masalahnya sains modern cuma fokus supaya dunia bisa diprediksi. Nah, nanti kita akan lihat bagaimana hubungannya. Please continue, Prof.
Right. A third dimension, and there are just four, but a third dimension is what I've called the organizational dimension. Once again, because religion and science are social practices, collective activities, things people do, rather than merely things people believe. Because they are things people do together, they have an organizational dimension. So the question to be asked there is, how do religious and scientific communities differ? What norms govern their behavior? What, for example, is the role played by authority within religion? And how does that differ from the role played by authority within science? So the organizational dimension has to do with the kind of community that is engaging in these practices.
Dimensi ketiga, dimensi organisasional. Jadi perlu diingat sekali lagi sains dan agama adalah sebuah aktivitas sehingga kedua-duanya punya suatu, mereka berada di dalam suatu komunitas. Dan mereka yang berada di dalam komunitas itu punya norma kebiasaan yang ada, ya, dan masing-masing punya caranya sendiri. Oke. Dan misalnya isu soal otoritas, isu soal nilai, cara kerja, segala macam. Nah, jadi pertanyaan adalah komunitas macam apa yang ada di dalam sains dan agama yang bisa kita bandingkan dan kemudian kita tentukan apakah berkontradiksi atau seperti apa.
Right, and a final dimension that I've identified, which again I'm following Michael Stenmark here, is the epistemological dimension. And there are at least two things here. Where do scientists draw their knowledge from? And where do religious believers draw their knowledge from? So religious believers often are dependent upon traditions which are thought to have some otherworldly source. So it might be a divine revelation, or it might be knowledge revealed to the sages long ago, as in the case of the Vedas. But in any case, you've got a tradition of knowledge going way back to some source which made contact with the world of the gods or spirits or ancestors. Science, of course, tends to think of its knowledge as emerging from a practice of inquiry by human beings. So knowledge claims are handled very differently in science. But the other aspect here that interests me a lot is that religions are very dependent often on storytelling, on narrative, on myth. Many religions have stories about the creation of the world or the origin of things. It might be the story of the dreaming in Australian Aboriginal culture, or it might be the story of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis. But these are kind of mythic tales about origins which shape people's behavior. You reapply the pattern of the myth in your everyday life. You reenact the life of Muhammad in some sense, or you reenact during the ceremonies of the Hajj what Ibrahim did, and so on. So you've got very different ways in which knowledge is passed on, in the case form of myth, as opposed to in the form of theory. And yeah, so those are at least two things which can be dealt with under the heading of this epistemological dimension. Where does knowledge come from, and in what form are claims to knowledge passed on?
Oke, jadi yang terakhir dimensi keempat, dimensi epistemologis. Jadi umumnya kepercayaan beragama kita yang samawi itu melihat bahwa kepercayaan religius independen dari tradisi pada umum, ya nggak sih? Wahyu ilahiyah kepada orang kudus, gitu kan? Misalnya ke Muhammad atau ke apa namanya nabi-nabi dan semacamnya, gitu ya. Jadi ada pengetahuan yang diperoleh daripada hubungan antara jadi ada pengetahuan yang diperoleh yang mana berasal dari interaksi antara dua dunia ya, dunia material dan dunia yang ilahiyah tersebut. Nah, sedangkan sains berbicara soal bagaimana pengetahuan diperoleh dari alam. Nah, agama, tapi di dalam konteks yang lainnya, ada juga yang dipahami bukan secara wahyu ilahiyah nih, tapi melalui yang namanya kebergantungan terhadap kisah, mitos, dan sebagainya. Soal asal-muasal dunia, mimpi, dan semacamnya yang kita temukan di suku-suku orang-orang asli gitu ya, di orang-orang aborigin, orang-orang Papua dan sebagainya. Kisah mitis daripada asal-muasal. Ya, dan itu ya, kita melihat bahwa dimensi epistemologis ini melihat dari mana sumber pengetahuan daripada masing-masing spheres atau wilayah antara sains dan agama tersebut. Okay, do you want to add more, Prof. Greg, of those?
Right. I think that's all I'd want to say right here and now about those four dimensions of the science and religion relation. But I think they do give once again a broader perspective. It's not just what does science say, what does religion say, it's what are each set of practices trying to achieve, how are their communities organized, and what kind of knowledge claims are they making? Where does this knowledge come from, and how is it passed on?
Jadi sekali lagi ini bicara bukan cuma soal apa yang proposisional ya, tapi lebih luas terkait tujuan dari sains agama masing-masing. Ingat ada 4 jenis sains ya tadi ya, antara komunitasnya dan juga pengetahuan itu kira-kira sumbernya dari itu. So I'll go into the next questions. So I could say that actually at the first time there was a time when we do not understand science as we understand today. What you said, like in correlative cosmology in China and natural philosophy and so on. So since when a clear distinction between scientific and religious beliefs developed, Prof. Dos?
Well, the story I tell in the book is that probably our modern distinctions between science and religion go back to Aristotle. And because Aristotle was studied by both Christian and Muslim thinkers, his thinking was, of course, enormously influential. But Aristotle makes a distinction between 3 types of knowledge, between theoretical knowledge, which is knowledge of the principles underlying the operation of the world, practical knowledge, which is knowledge about how to live, and productive sciences or knowledge, which is about how to create things, in a sense. So the knowledge of the craftsman or the artist. So here we have 3 forms of knowledge. What's really interesting here, I think, is the distinction between the theoretical, the way the world operates, and the practical, which is how you are to live. So practical knowledge is, or practical philosophy, what we might call moral philosophy, is now distinguished from theoretical knowledge. So, and although they're both part of the task of philosophy, the question of how you are to live, which is a central question for all forms of religion, is now separated from the question of what are the principles underlying the operations of the natural world. So you now have something of a distinction between natural philosophy and moral philosophy. And I think this at least begins separating the goals of religion from the goals of science, because moral philosophy, which like religion deals with how we are to live, is distinguished from understanding the principles by which the natural world operates. In many cultures, this would seem a strange distinction to make, but it's a very important distinction for those whose philosophy is influenced by Aristotle.
Yeah, I'll translate, Prof. Jadi, sejak kapan sih perbedaan antara sains agama atau pengetahuan saintifik dan pengetahuan agama itu terjadi? Distingsinya sejak kapan? Bisa dibilang ternyata itu sejak Aristoteles nih. Karena Aristoteles membedakan 3 macam pengetahuan, ya kan? Pengetahuan teoretikal, praktikal, dan deduktif. Pengetahuan teoretikal itu pengetahuan cara daripada bagaimana dunia bekerja. Pengetahuan praktikal itu bagaimana cara kita hidup, ya, filsafat moral. Atau kalau yang ketiga, produktif, itu bagaimana kita bisa memproduksi sesuatu, seni, crafting, dan semacamnya. Nah, distingsi yang ini tuh penting, karena ini membuat kita memahami bahwa sejak zaman Aristoteles ini mulai ada bibit-bibitnya. Gitu ya. Jadi mulai ada perbedaan antara filsafat alam, cara untuk memahami alam, dan antara filsafat moral. Nah, ini yang memulai perbedaan atau pembedaan antara tujuan dari sains agama. Jadi tadinya diffuse tuh, tadinya tuh tergabung, gitu ya. Tergabung lah, campur-campur. Tapi pembedaan ini akhirnya membuat kita mulai, oh ini sains, ini agama. Oh ini soal cara hidup, ini soal cara memahami dunia, gitu ya. Filsafat moral yang kayak agama memahami cara hidup, dan yang kedua filsafat alam itu untuk memahami dunia yang bekerja. Gitu. Jadi dan ini sangat berpengaruh buat orang-orang yang memang mengadopsi filsafat Aristoteles. And I could say, Prof, that those who believe or who influenced by Aristotle's way of thinking is those who in the medieval times, could I say that? The philosophers in the medieval times.
Yes, certainly medieval philosophers. But I think another factor that led to a separation or a distinction between science and religion was that certainly in medieval Europe, perhaps to a lesser degree in the Muslim world, but certainly in medieval Europe, the universities gain a certain institutional autonomy from the church. So not entirely, of course, the two are still connected in various ways, but the universities become self-governing bodies of scholars who have a degree of freedom to pursue their inquiries, so they can pursue natural philosophy without immediately engaging with matters of religion. And what you find is that some of the followers of Aristotle in medieval universities are doing this. They're trying to explain the natural world without reference to God. And that's, I think, the beginning of, or certainly not the beginning of, but a continuation of this ancient scientific attitude.
Jadi selain pembedaan tadi, kita ngelihat juga di abad pertengahan kan mulai muncul universitas ya. Universitas muncul, mulai ada orang-orang akademisi punya gelar kebebasan untuk meneliti filsafat alam tanpa berurusan sama sekali dengan agama misalnya. Dan para pengikut Aristoteles itu mengikuti hal-hal tersebut, dan ini bisa dibilang menjadi suatu kelanjutan ya, bukan suatu hal baru sebenarnya, tapi suatu kelanjutan yang nantinya akan memuncak juga di abad modern. Anything you want to add, Prof.
Yeah, I think just to get back to that point about the Aristotelian distinction between theoretical and practical science or knowledge, if you look at what I call the correlative cosmology of ancient China, that which gave us these principles of qi, this underlying substance, yin and yang, and the resonance between different types of beings and the five elements and so on. This ancient Chinese correlative cosmology also gave principles which made human existence intelligible. It didn't just tell you how the natural world operated, it also gave you a framework for knowing how you ought to act as well. And so its goals, if you think of the goal of religion as that of giving existential intelligibility, as Denmark says, of making the world, making it clear how we are to live. Here we have a form of science which does that in a way which we wouldn't consider it to be the task of science to do. So here we have a form of science which includes providing guidance for how to live. This seems to me to be very different from the tradition of science which emerged from the Aristotelian.
Oke, contoh lainnya ya. Bukan contoh lainnya, contoh yang mana kita bisa lihat yang berbeda daripada sains kekinian modern pada umumnya. Itu kosmologi relatif yang ada di China kuno gitu ya. Gimana pemahamannya soal qi, 5 elemen dan sebagainya. Kosmologi korelatif ini bukan hanya menjelaskan soal bagaimana kerja daripada alam semesta, ya kan? Kan kalau Cina kuno itu kan suka ngomongin soal bintang, terus bagaimana itu berrelasi dengan semesta dan semacamnya. Tapi juga soal bagaimana cara kita sebagai manusia hidup diberikan konteks dunia semacam itu. Jadi agama memberikan makna eksistensial yang masuk akal, tapi demikian juga sains melakukan hal seperti itu yang tidak dilakukan oleh sains pada umumnya yang kita kenal. Anything to add, Prof?
I think that's probably enough from me on that topic, but is there more you want to, what did you have some further questions, Samuel?
Sorry, Professor?
You had some further questions, did you?
Oh yeah, I have one more questions. Two more questions. So
no,
before the development happened, could you share, other than the correlative cosmology, how should we actually understand the relation between science and religion? So nowadays, usually people try to say that there is a conflict, etc., etc. But how should we actually understand before the modern science one, the relation between science and religion?
Well, I think it varies from place to place and society to society. But for example, if you take what Alan Strathern calls the immanentist religions, where deity is thought of as very much within the natural world, as in the case of animistic faiths. For example, amongst the Maori people of my own country, the indigenous people of New Zealand, natural objects, natural things were thought of as related to each other in a kind of big family tree. Which eventually went going back to the gods. So if you asked about the natural world, you'll be given a story about the relationship of all natural objects, as we would think of them, and their history, their origins, but that story would take you back to the world of the gods. Just as, for example, in Australian Aboriginal cultures, knowledge of the natural world will take you back to their time of the dreaming, where these mythic creatures walked across the landscape and shaped it. So in these, and also in these societies, because religious practices are dispersed through the whole society, you don't have a religious institution distinct from a scientific institution. So in these societies, it really makes very little sense to speak about a relationship between science and religion. The two are too closely interwoven. Scientific activity or proto-scientific activity and religious activity are interwoven in a way which makes it impossible to speak about a distinction between science and religion.
Ya, oke, I'll translate. Jadi, teman-teman, pertanyaannya, apakah sains berkonflik, berdialog, integrasi, atau bagaimana? Nah, seperti yang tadi kita sudah bicarakan dari awal, pada faktanya itu beragam. Jadi nggak cuma satu cara aja untuk memahami hubungan antara sains dan agama, gitu ya. Orang Maori, misalnya orang Maori yang ada di Selandia Baru, di New Zealand. Buat orang Maori, yang alam, objek-objek alam itu berelasi atau berhubungan ya, antara yang satu dengan yang lainnya. Dan mereka adalah satu keluarga pohon-pohonan yang pada akhirnya merujuk kepada dewa-dewi tertentu. Jadi kalau nanya soal dunia alam, ya kita akan melihat hubungan daripada keseluruhannya bagi orang-orang Maori. Nah, atau kalau misalnya orang-orang aborigin, buat orang-orang aborigin, pengetahuan akan yang alam akan membawa kita kembali kepada fase mimpi ya dahulu ketika dunia belum ada pertama-tama. Nah, jadi di masyarakat ini mereka nggak memiliki institusi yang berbeda nih antara institusi agama dan juga institusi sains. Jadi campur aduk. Jadi apakah bisa dipahami sebagai suatu konflik? Jadi tidak. Kita perlu cara memahami yang lainnya. You want to add other problems?
So I think in a way, what I've been trying to say is the question about the relation between science and religion could only arise at a particular point in history, in a particular society shaped by a whole set of assumptions about knowledge. And I think that's important to realize, that there are societies in which this isn't a question because how they thought of knowledge was different. And the example of the Chinese, I think, is really interesting, that this Chinese cosmology you find in some of the ancient writers was what guided the actions of the emperor, for example. So rather than having a church telling the emperor how one ought to act, or rather than having religious scholars telling the caliph how one ought to act, you had the emperor consulting the philosophers who had this picture of the world which gave guidance to the emperor about how the emperor ought to act. So in that context, one of the big functions of religion was actually supplied by what we might think of as a form of science, broadly understood.
Dan misalnya di masyarakat China sebelumnya, yang tadi ya korelatif kosmologi korelatifnya, mereka berpikir bahwa apa yang langit katakan atau Tian, ya, kalau nggak salah ya, Tian itu ketika itu mengatakan soal bagaimana cara emperor atau cara raja-raja itu harus bersikap gitu ya. Jadi para filsuf menginterpretasi langit tersebut gitu ya, bintang, bulan, matahari dan semacamnya gitu ya. Tahu lah ya nonton Avatar segala macam. Jadi ketika mereka menginterpretasi itu, mereka akan memberitahu kepada para raja-raja soal apa yang harus mereka lakukan. Jadi di sini kita melihat lagi bahwa agama dan sains sangat dekat relasinya. Yeah, of those. You want to add something more?
No, just that really it varies. I think so. Once again, it was to sort of deprovincialize our way of thinking, to realize that the way in which science and religion relate in our society is only one of many ways in which knowledge about the natural world and knowledge about the world of the gods. So if you think of science and religion very broadly as science as a way of knowing about the natural world, and religion as a way of knowing about the gods, then these two have varied enormously in how they relate to one another over the course of human history. So that's what I was trying to highlight.
Yeah, I got. Yeah, it's really interesting. Your idea. So it's not as simple like it's in conflict. It is in dialogue, but we need to see in a broader perspective that what's happened actually in the past in the history, if I'm not correct. Just like what you wrote in your book, which science, whose religion, actually, when we're trying to say the relation between the both of them.
Yeah, and in a way, what I was doing there, of course, when I asked which science, whose religion, I was alluding, of course, to Alistair MacIntyre's book, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? But of course, the same question arises there. One of MacIntyre's insights is that our thinking occurs within traditions of thought, which are very different across human cultures. And although there are ways of assessing them and judging between them, nonetheless, they're not incommensurable, but nonetheless, they are different starting points. And we need to be aware that our thinking has a particular historical starting point that would have seemed strange to other people. For example, David Hume's question of how can you deduce an ought from an is, the fact-value distinction, so characteristic of modern philosophy, simply would have seemed very peculiar to a follower of Aristotle, as it would have to an ancient Chinese thinker. So questions that seem so obvious to us as modern philosophers emerge from a particular tradition of thinking which began somewhere and which is not universal.
Ya, translate. Jadi teman-teman, sekali lagi poinnya adalah kalau mau ngomongin soal kira-kira hubungan sains dan agama itu apa sih, kita harus bertanya terlebih dahulu. Sains yang mana, agamanya siapa? Kenapa? Karena pada kenyataannya, kalau kita melihat kepada sepanjang sejarah, masing-masing komunitas itu punya caranya masing-masing dalam menjawab pertanyaan tersebut. Tadi orang-orang Maori dan Aborigin punya caranya sendiri, orang-orang Cina kuno punya caranya sendiri, orang-orang abad pertengahan punya caranya sendiri, dan kita punya caranya sendiri. Dan kita harus sadar akan bawaan tradisi atau ideologi kita. Jadi kita nggak semata-mata langsung bawa aja, gitu ya. Ada konflik segala macam. Bisa mundur ke belakang. Misalnya pertanyaan David Hume soal pembedaan antara yang ada, yang adalah dan yang harus, is and of. Itu mungkin pertanyaan yang aneh buat orang-orang yang ngikutin Aristoteles atau orang-orang yang ngikutin kosmologi China-nya dulu. Itu pertanyaan aneh dan memang muncul karena satu alasan atau satu fase tertentu, gitu loh. Jadi menarik banget ya, teman-teman. Sekali lagi, nggak sesederhana itu. Okay, maybe I'll ask my last questions, Prof. Tos. So I want to emphasize, we could say that when we're talking about the relation between those two limbs, science and religion, we need to make sure, just like what you said, which science, whose religion. But I'm thinking that actually, isn't it the fact that when people talk about the relation between science and religion, people tend to assume that the existing relationship, whether a conflict or other typologies, is related to the science that currently exists, that is modern science, and also the religion that is currently generally embraced, the institutional religion? Or is it precisely that assumption that, in your opinion, we should change?
I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking that question. And of course, lots of people have. So people like Ian Barber, whose typology you were alluding to, you know, conflict or harmony or whatever. There's no harm asking the question about how does modern science relate to modern, to you know, our institutional forms of religion. And in fact, in my book on Galileo, I was very interested in just that question. How did the modern religion and science conflict develop in the time of Galileo? What lay behind Galileo's conflict with the Catholic Church? But as I said at the beginning, if one of the tasks of philosophy is to examine the assumptions that underlie our ordinary ways of thinking, then this means calling into question the way things we take for granted. So, for example, as I just wrote in the chat, we take for granted there's a clear distinction between fact and value, between is and ought. David Hume famously says, you can't deduce an is from an ought. And a great deal of modern philosophy had been devoted to trying to see how this gap could be bridged. But I think it's important to realize that to an Aristotelian, for example, a follower of Aristotle in the Middle Ages, this would have seemed a very, very strange question. Why? Because for Aristotelians, all things act in a way which seeks to achieve the goal of their own good. Goodness is sort of inherent in the nature of things. All things strive to achieve the fulfillment of their nature, which is what is good for them. So Aristotelian natural philosophy had an idea of goodness within the world, inherent in it. You didn't have to think, where is this good in a world which contains no values? In fact, Husserl writes about this in The Crisis of European Sciences, coming from the phenomenological tradition. Husserl writes about the way in which modern science stripped the world of value, but in so doing, set up a problem which hadn't previously existed. How do you get goodness back into a world from which value has been stripped? That's been a problem which modern philosophy has grappled with, but it's a problem which only arose because of the nature of modern science.
Oke, I'll translate it. Jadi saya nanya teman-teman, bukannya sekarang kita udah kalau ngomongin soal hubungan antara sains agama, udah langsung rujuknya ke ini ya, agama kita, agama institusional, dan juga sains modern. Terus buat apa dong ngomongin beginian? Sebenarnya gini poinnya, kalau tugas filsafat adalah untuk mencari tahu asumsi yang kita miliki, ya asumsi yang kita anggap benar, maka adalah penting untuk mempertanyakan apa yang tadi Prof. tanyakan, gitu ya, which science whose religion, yang mana kutip dari bukunya McIntyre juga ya, yang ngomongin soal which is rationality itu. Jadi kayak minjem gitu loh. Nah, kembali pakai contoh Aristoteles itu bakalan bingung sama pertamanya David Hume. Gitu, karena bagi Aristotelian, semua hal di dunia ini punya tujuan untuk menuju kebaikannya masing-masing, yang mana berada di dalam dirinya sendiri. Gitu. Jadi, yes, itu adalah pada saat bersamaan off juga kalau buat Aristoteles. Gitu ya. Nah, jadi begitu konteksnya teman-teman. Sekali lagi, kita perlu memperluas pemahaman kita ketika kita bicara soal hubungan antara sains dan agama, dan tidak semerta-merta melihat secara naif ya, tanpa sadar upbringing kita yang mana kental dengan nuansa modern gitu. Jadi teman-teman. Okay, Prof. Daus, you did anything? Do you want to add anything?
Yes, I'm just actually putting in the chat at the moment that point about Husserl. Edmund Husserl, the great founder of phenomenology, in a work called The Crisis of European Sciences, he makes the point that by its method of mathematical modeling and experimentation, modern science stripped the world of value, leaving us now trying to understand what sort of a quality goodness is, because goodness finds no place within the world of modern science, whereas goodness did find a place within the world of Aristotelian natural philosophy. And so J.L. Mackie, famously in his work on ethics, remarked that goodness is a strange, a queer quality, not in the modern colloquial sense of relating to gay people and homosexuality, but a queer quality in the sense of just a really odd one, because it doesn't fit into a scientific view of the world. But this is because of a certain development, the development of a certain kind of science. And I think we need to understand that the things we take for granted as modern philosophers are things which have emerged from particular developments in particular European intellectual history and shouldn't just be taken for granted.
I think that's what Goff once tried to say juga ya. Isn't it Goff and his Galileo's error about the science that read out the values thing itu ya? Am I right? Prof. Daus, Philip Goff talking about the value that got rid because of the modern science ideas of the world.
Right. I'm not. Who was this again? Philip Goff.
Philip Goff. Galileo's error.
Galileo's error. Yes. Right. Yeah. Well, actually, I talk in my lectures about Galileo's mistake, which was the reducing of what's real to primary qualities. and secondary qualities, the experience qualities, which include goodness and value, get reduced to what's merely subjective. And I think, yes, this was a kind of, well, whether you want to call it a mistake, an error, it was a move made which gave us a very productive kind of science. On the other hand, it left us with a somewhat impoverished worldview as well. And I think that's the other thing that motivated this book, was the sense that, look, while modern science has given us enormous gifts, it's also, if you take it as the guide to the way the world is, it also gives us a somewhat impoverished world. And there are other ways of thinking about the natural world which can complement what modern science offers.
Okay, I'll translate. Jadi terakhir teman-teman ya, sains modern itu menyingkirkan nilai gitu ya. Jadi mengaburkan antara nilai dan fakta. Jadi dua-dua hal yang beda. Kalau kata Husserl gitu ya, Husserl penemu daripada pendekatan fenomenologi gitu ya. Kebaikan nggak bisa lagi diperbincangkan sama sains modern, dan bahkan J.L. Mackie, filsuf itu berkata bahwa kebaikan adalah hal yang aneh bagi dunia modern ini gitu ya. Yang ide yang unik atau absurd, bukan absurd ya, aneh gitu ya. Dan hal ini sekali lagi kita bisa ambil asalnya daripada sains modern. Dan yang penting sekali lagi yang dikatakan oleh buku ini adalah bagaimana kita perlu sekali lagi untuk melihat asumsi-asumsi bawaan yang kita miliki, yang sebenarnya asalnya daripada masa modern tersebut. Jadi bukan datang dari langit, tapi ada proses sejarah di baliknya. Tapi poinnya adalah nggak bisa dipungkiri, sains modern memang memberikan kemajuan, ya. Bagaimana Galileo memisahkan antara kualitas primer dan sekunder dan segala macam yang bisa teman-teman baca juga di buku Prof. Daus dan juga Philip Goff yang tadi saya mention, itu memberi kemajuan, dan itu adalah sebuah gerakan yang ya ada hal yang baik dan ada hal yang buruk yang didapatkan dari hal tersebut. Yeah, so yeah, Prof. Daus, I think that's all my questions. Do you have anything to add, Prof. Daus, more?
No, I am very happy with with what I've talked about. I mean, these are big and difficult topics, but I've enjoyed the chance to talk about them.
Ya. So, teman-teman, kalau ada pertanyaan mungkin boleh hands up atau boleh chat aja di chat box, atau mungkin topiknya memang agak berat ya. So, Prof. Daus, maybe I need to give you some context. Actually, the audiences of Scholia is quite diverse. Start from those who do not learn philosophy academically. I mean, they just learn it, read the books, but they do not learn it through the academia, through university. They put interest, but also at the same time, some graduate students and even my own lecturer in Universitas Indonesia. So yeah, it's quite diverse here in Scholia Indonesia.
Yeah. I hope this hasn't been too technical for those who are not familiar with the academic debate, but yes.
Yeah, I personally really enjoyed this time, and also untuk teman, I want to talk to the audience, Prof. Daus. Jadi teman-teman, anyway, you guys could check the book in the Cambridge. You could check it out. I already put it on the chat actually at the first time. Maybe I'll share it again through the Twitter account. And also I actually write a short review of Prof. Daus' book. Maybe I could send it to you guys. If you guys need it, I'll send it to you guys, and maybe you could check out the book in the Cambridge. One of the chapters from Cambridge Elements in Philosophy of Religion. That actually a lot of writings that really good there. Okay. So no questions, Franz, Fox, Velas?
Oh, I've got a question here in the chat.
Oh yeah. Oh, what are the limits? Oh yeah, Sion. Actually, Sion is one of my he takes physics as his graduate studies. Okay, I'll read it, Prof. Daus. What are the limits when we can say that our approach of scientific knowledge has a religious bias? Or is it justifiable if we have those religious biases because of religion gives real meaning to science?
Right. I'm not sure if I quite understand the question. I mean, is it a question about whether religious knowledge could complement
Yes,
what
yeah,
the
I think
scientists give
that's
us?
what
Yep.
science Sion means, Prof. Dos.
Yep. Yeah. I think there's a case to be made for that. I think, of course, as a philosopher of religion, I want to ask questions about how religious claims can be justified, or, what sort of evidence can we have for the truth of religious claims. And I'm happy to admit that that evidence can be different from the kind of evidence a scientist might look for. But I'm certainly very keen on the idea that science is a particular kind of practice which gives us a certain kind of knowledge of the world. But I'm very opposed to the idea sometimes known as scientism, that the limits of our knowledge are set by science, that there are no other ways of knowing. So I think, yes, that there can be other ways of understanding the world which complement those of the sciences, I think is, essential. To what degree religion is one of those will be up for debate, but at least in principle, I think, yes. There's another question here. Right. Oh, yes. Thanks, Sion. You're working on neuroscience. Very interesting. There's been quite a lot of interesting work on neuroscience and religion in recent decades. So that's great. Thank you, Sion. Samuel, I think you're muted. Did you want to?
Oh, yeah. We once invited Kelly James Clark here in Scully to talk his books, God and the Brain. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Neuroscience.
Yeah. I'm not really familiar with it, but I know of it. Yes. Good.
Yeah. Okay, jadi itu Sion sih.
Are there any other questions?
I don't think there's more questions from the audiences. So anyway, Prof, I want to do you want so Olaf, do you want to ask something or what? No. If you do want to ask something, I could unmute your microphone and you could ask directly to Prof. Okay, sure, I could.
Olaf, you have a wonderful collection of books behind you there. It's a lovely backdrop for your Zoom call.
Thank you very much, Professor Dos. Unfortunately, it's very only metaphysical. It's not actual. It's not actual books. But thank you very much.
Only metaphysical.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Dos. It's a very interesting discussion that you gave this morning. I do really like your point on the problem of how modern science basically caused the problem of stripping a lot of value and you could say, I guess, morality in the modern world. And you also mentioned in the previous question about how you're actually opposed to scientism, which is something I agree, which is setting out the limit of our knowledge and science. But there is a debate, because I'm also someone from a scientific background, not exactly a philosophical background, in that in the history of science, especially throughout the 20th century and to now, there's been like a disregard of only focusing on the facts. Like, for instance, in modern quantum mechanics, Einstein was, I think, the last one to debate that a lot of what quantum mechanics actually infers is that it will strip a lot of meaning in the world, but a lot of scientists disregard that point because the empirical data match what they found in their observation. So a lot of modern debate is said that, okay, let's just put morality aside and focus on developing science and engineering, but that unintentionally, you guess, lead to where we are now. And right now, there is actually a debate from a lot of people in the scientific community that says, well, should we begin to also put morality back in science, which is in some way I agree, but I also concerned with, I guess, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think like maybe Sam Harris, like he actually, yeah, I guess with a lot of what Sam Harris actually proposed, like actually defining morality with like a lot of subjects in neuroscience and actually quantifying actual morality. I just want to know, what are your thoughts on that kind of movement and discussion that are happening right now in the scientific community?
Thank you, Olaf.
That's a very, very good question, Olaf. Yes, I'd certainly, like you, be very unhappy with the approach of someone like Sam Harris, or even someone like Edward Wilson, the sociobiologist who wanted ethics taken out of the hands of philosophers and put in the hands of biologists. This seems to me to be horrendous, a very worrying thing, because I think often people like Sam Harris have a very poor understanding of what moral reasoning involves. So I don't think it's a matter of taking ethics and putting it in the hands of scientists to deal with in the same way that they deal with any other scientific question. It's a matter of expanding what we regard as legitimate ways of knowing to include moral reflection alongside science. So in a way, I'm happy to keep scientific method as we know it and moral reasoning as distinct. I just want them both to be recognized as ways of knowing.
Okay, Olaf, do you have any follow-up questions? I'll try to unmute again if you have any follow-up questions. Yeah.
But thank you, Olaf. That was a very good, very interesting question.
Yeah.
And a good one.
I'll translate it to the audiences, Prof. Daus and Olaf.
Yeah.
Jadi teman-teman, pertanyaan Olaf ini soal apa yang mau dikerjakan sama Sam Harris gitu ya, membawa moralitas ke ranahnya sains gitu. Setuju gak Prof. Daus sama hal tersebut? Prof. Daus tidak setuju gitu ya. Dan buat Prof. Daus, Sam Harris itu punya pemahaman yang buruk soal cara kerja reasoning, moral reasoning ya, cara kerja, cara berpikir tentang moral gitu loh. Dan itu kayaknya bahaya kalau tadi kita dengar menurut Prof. Daus itu cukup bahaya untuk berpikir seperti Sam Harris. Jadi penting gitu ya untuk acknowledge science dan moral reasoning, tapi jangan dicampur adukin ya. Jadi science tidak legitimate untuk ngomongin moralitas kalau bisa dibilang, tapi kedua-duanya adalah cara memahami yang legitimate ya, secara terpisah dan penting begitu. Jadi aku rasa itu jawabannya. Okay, Prof. Daus, I guess that's the questions from the audiences. So yeah, I think it's quite long, 1 hour and 15 minutes. Thank you so much.
It is.
Prof. Daus.
Right. Well, I'm going to go out and enjoy the sunshine here. It's quite cold, but it's only 10 degrees, but it's lovely and sunny. So I might get out and enjoy the sunshine.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Prof. Daus. And yeah, I heard that there's a lockdown there in New Zealand. I hope it's all okay. Yeah.
Yes, we had avoided the Delta variant of COVID up until now, but it's now got loose in the community. So we're all locked down. We're allowed to go out for some exercise, but other than that, we have to stay at home. So, but I'm sure you're all too familiar with this situation.
Yeah, we all
yes.
familiar with it.
Yes.
Yeah. I hope you're doing well. And yeah, thank you so much again for your willingness to talk for 1 hour and 15 minutes here. It's really a big pleasure. And yeah, it's an honor to have you to talk about your recent book.
It's very lovely to be able to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so maybe I'm going to finish it today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the audiences. Maybe we could talk about some other issues again in the next week. And yeah, I guess I'll finish the discussions and I'll talk to you later in some other times, Prof. Daus. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you indeed.